At 87 years old, Pastor Shirley Caesar stood before her church congregation and made an announcement that silenced the room. For 6 decades, her voice had shaped gospel music and inspired millions. But a heartbreaking diagnosis had changed everything. Doctors delivered news that forced her to confront a question she never thought she'd face. How do you say goodbye to the only life you've ever known? Her decision would shock her family, her fans, and the entire gospel community. In 1938, a baby girl was born in Durham, North Carolina. Her name was Shirley Caesar. On the surface, her childhood looked like so many others in her neighborhood. A close-knit family, a church at the center of everything, music filling the rooms. But there was something different about little Shirley from the very beginning. Her father, Bishop David Caesar, wasn't just any preacher. He was a man of deep conviction and spiritual authority. Her mother sang in the church choir, her voice steady and true. And Shirley? She absorbed it all like a sponge absorbs water. The 1950s were brutal years in America. Segregation divided the country like a scar. Black families faced impossible choices every single day. Where to eat, where to sit, where they were allowed to exist. Hope was a luxury. But in the churches, something magical happened. Gospel music became more than entertainment. It became survival. It became prayer made audible. Children like Shirley grew up hearing that music every single day, and it shaped how they understood the world. By her teenage years, Shirley's voice had become something else entirely. Teachers noticed it first. Choir directors couldn't believe what they were hearing. Here was a young girl with a voice so powerful, so raw, so deeply spiritual that it seemed to come from somewhere beyond her years. She wasn't just singing words. She was speaking directly to people's pain. When Shirley sang, listeners felt seen. They felt understood. They felt less alone. In 1966, at just 28 years old, Shirley Caesar made a decision that would alter the course of gospel music forever. She formed the Shirley Caesar Singers. What happened next wasn't just a music career launching. It was a movement taking flight. Her albums began winning Grammy Awards. Churches across the country packed out to hear her perform. Radio stations played her voice in kitchens, in cars, in bedrooms where people were praying for strength they didn't have. But success brought something else with it, something darker. As her reputation grew, so did the pressure to be perfect. Never show weakness. Always be the strong one. Always have the answer. For over 50 years, Shirley Caesar carried this burden without complaint. She became the woman people turned to when they had nowhere else to go. She became the voice of faith when faith was all people had left. And this is where things took a darker turn. Behind the scenes, away from the spotlight and the cheering congregations, Shirley Caesar was living a double life, not in a scandalous way, but in a way that strong people often do. The woman the world saw was unbreakable. She was the pillar. She was the answer. But the woman in private was carrying a weight that no amount of faith could fully lift. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Shirley's schedule became inhuman. She would perform one night in Atlanta, drive through the morning, and be leading a church service by evening. She recorded albums while managing a congregation. She mentored young singers while raising her own family. She traveled constantly, her body always moving, always giving, never stopping long enough to hear what was trying to tell her. Her family watched this unfold with a mixture of pride and worry. Her children saw their mother as a superhero, but they also saw the exhaustion in her eyes. They noticed how she would sit down and immediately need to stand again because sitting meant thinking. Thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant confronting the reality that she was human, something she had spent decades refusing to acknowledge. The pressure came from everywhere, from her church, which depended on her leadership and her presence, from her fans, who saw her as a symbol of unshakable faith in a world falling apart, from other pastors and musicians who looked to her as proof that you could achieve greatness while maintaining perfect spiritual integrity. But most of all, the pressure came from within. Shirley had internalized a belief that was common in her community and her era, that showing weakness was a betrayal of faith, that admitting struggle was failing God. So she kept pushing. She kept performing. She kept giving. She told herself that rest was weakness, that slowing down meant letting people down, That vulnerability was a luxury she couldn't afford. Year after year, she added more to her plate, more churches to lead, more people depending on her, more reasons to keep going, no matter what her body was screaming. What she didn't know was that this unsustainable pace was building towards something, a reckoning that couldn't be delayed forever, a moment when her body would simply refuse to keep up with her will. And that moment was coming closer than anyone realized. By the 1980s, Shirley Caesar had become something almost mythical in the gospel world. She wasn't just a singer anymore. She was an institution. Her name was synonymous with authenticity, with power, with the kind of faith that doesn't bend or break. When young pastors wanted to understand what it meant to lead with integrity, they studied Shirley. When singers wanted to know how to connect with an audience on a spiritual level, they listened to Shirley. When families were struggling and needed hope, they turned to Shirley's music. The accolades kept coming. More Grammy Awards, more album releases, more invitations to speak at conferences and lead revivals across the country. She founded churches. She started mentorship programs. She became a fixture not just in gospel music, but in the broader conversation about faith, community, and Black spiritual leadership in America. But there was a cost to all of this that nobody talked about. The constant performance. The endless expectation that she would always have the right words, the right answer, the right spiritual framework for whatever pain someone brought to her. People would line up after services just to touch her, to ask her to pray for them, to seek her blessing. She couldn't say no. How could she? These were people in genuine need. People whose lives had been changed by her ministry. Her body was sending signals that she ignored. Fatigue that went deeper than a long tour. Small aches that wouldn't disappear no matter how much rest she got. And rest was something she rarely allowed herself anyway. There were nights she couldn't sleep, not because of insomnia, but because her mind wouldn't stop working. Always planning the next service. Always thinking about someone who needed help. Always carrying other people's burdens on her shoulders. Her doctors noticed it during routine checkups. "You need to slow down," they would say. Shirley would nod, smile, and then book another tour. Her family noticed it too. Her children would suggest she take time off, and she would say yes, but then she wouldn't. She couldn't, because in her mind, stopping meant abandoning the very people who depended on her most. It meant failing, and Shirley Caesar did not fail. What nobody understood, not even Shirley herself, was that this unsustainable pattern couldn't continue indefinitely. The human body has limits that even the strongest spirit cannot override, and those limits were approaching. The 1990s brought a shift, though Shirley couldn't quite name it first. She was in her 50s now, an age when most people start thinking about winding down, about legacy, about what comes next. But Shirley was busier than ever. If anything, she accelerated. She launched new initiatives. She traveled more. She took on more responsibilities. It was as if she was racing against an invisible clock, trying to accomplish everything she could before some unspoken deadline arrived. Her close friends began to notice something changing, not in her faith or her commitment. That was as strong as ever, but in her presence. There was a tiredness there that wasn't just physical. It was the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying too much for too long, the kind that settles into your bones and becomes part of who you are. In 2010, Shirley suffered a stroke. It was a wake-up call that should have forced a reckoning. For a few weeks after, people around her held their breath. Would this be the moment she finally stopped? Would this be the moment she admitted that she was human, that she had limits, that her body couldn't keep up with her will indefinitely? But Shirley recovered, and within months, she was back to the schedule, back to the performances, back to leading her church and mentoring young artists and being the pillar that everyone depended on. The stroke had been a warning, but she treated it like a temporary setback rather than a fundamental truth about her mortality. Her family watched this with a mixture of love and frustration. They understood her calling. They respected her dedication. But they also knew that she was hurting in ways she wouldn't admit. They could see it in how she moved, in the way she would grip the back of a chair for balance when she thought nobody was looking, in the careful way she managed her energy through each day. By her 70s, Shirley Caesar had accomplished more than most people could dream of. She had shaped an entire genre of music. She had touched millions of lives. She had built something that would outlast her. But the question that nobody dared ask was, at what cost? And more importantly, how much longer could she sustain this? The years between 2010 and 2020 were a study in contradiction. Outwardly, Shirley Caesar continued to be the unstoppable force that the world knew her to be. She performed at major events. She recorded new music. She gave interviews where she spoke about her faith with the same conviction and clarity that had defined her entire career. To anyone watching from the outside, she was still the same Shirley, unbreakable, unwavering, eternal. But inside her body, things were changing in ways she couldn't ignore anymore. The fatigue became something she couldn't sleep away. The aches became something she couldn't pray through. There were mornings when she woke up and had to take a moment just to remember how to move. There were evenings when she would sit in her study, alone, and feel the weight of 6 decades pressing down on her in a way that was no longer bearable. Her children finally began to have harder conversations with her. Not just gentle suggestions, but real talks. They loved her. They admired her. But they were also her children, and they were watching their mother slowly disappear into a role she had perfected so completely that she had lost herself inside it. "Mom," they would say, "you've given enough. You've done enough. Please, just rest." But Shirley couldn't rest. Resting meant stopping. Stopping meant admitting defeat. And in her mind, admitting defeat meant letting down everyone who had depended on her all these years. Her congregation, her fans, her community, the legacy she had spent her entire life building. By the time she turned 80, the cracks were becoming impossible to hide. She moved more slowly. She tired more easily. She had to carefully manage her energy just to get through a single church service. But she kept going. Year after year, she kept pushing forward, telling herself and everyone around her that she was fine, that she still had more to give, that God wouldn't call her home until her work was done. What she didn't know was that God or fate or her own body had other plans, and those plans would force her to finally confront a truth she had spent her entire life avoiding. The diagnosis came in 2021, when Shirley Caesar was 83 years old. She had finally agreed to undergo comprehensive medical testing after her family had practically begged her. Years of ignoring warning signs had caught up with her. Years of pushing her body beyond its limits had consequences that couldn't be reversed with prayer or willpower or sheer determination. The doctors were gentle but direct. Her heart wasn't what it used to be. Her body was wearing down. At her age, with her medical history, there were serious limitations on what she could do going forward. They didn't use the word dying, not directly, but that's what they were saying. Her body was in the process of shutting down, one system at a time, and there was nothing modern medicine could do to stop it. Shirley sat in that doctor's office and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in decades. Fear. Not for herself, exactly. She had always believed that death was just a transition, a doorway to something better. But fear for what would happen to everyone who depended on her. Fear that if she stopped, everything would fall apart. Fear that her entire life's work would somehow crumble without her there to hold it together. She didn't tell anyone at first. Not her family. Not her church. She carried the diagnosis alone for weeks, processing it in private, trying to figure out how to keep going without letting anyone know that something fundamental had shifted. But secrets have a way of leaking out, especially in close families and tight-knit communities. Her daughter noticed first. She saw her mother moving differently, breathing differently, carrying herself with a fragility that hadn't been there before. "Mom, what's wrong?" she asked. And finally, after all these years of silence, Shirley told her. She told her about the diagnosis. She told her about the limitations. She told her about the fear that was eating her alive. Not fear of death, but fear of what would happen if she finally stopped. Her family called a meeting. Her children, her grandchildren, her closest advisors. And for the first time in her life, Shirley Caesar allowed herself to be vulnerable in front of the people she loved most. She admitted that she couldn't do this alone anymore. She admitted that she was afraid. She admitted that she didn't know how to be anything other than the strong one. And that's when everything changed.